Deadly Premonition 2 got a fair number of negative reviews, even from people that liked Deadly Premonition 1. In my opinion, this is because Deadly Premonition 2 has some of the worst pacing I've ever seen. It's astonishing. Most beloved janky games give you elbow room because they understand that their presentation is not very good. That wasn't the focus of the game. They know that you're not always going to be in the mood for everything they have to offer because the things they have to offer are not super polished. A good example of that would be Skyrim. It lets you go do whatever you're in the mood for today and avoid whatever you're not in the mood for today. Deadly Premonition 2, however, decided to go super linear, and I don't really know why. It's almost like it's a TV show rather than a game. They can't do this, not very well, because they are not a polished experience. They didn't put their money into polishing the experience. They put their money into putting in some stuff they wanted me to see. Classically, that should mean that they let me run around and do whatever I want for however long I want because they understand that I'm not always going to be in the mood for whatever jank they have on offer. A good example would be the first hour of the game, which we've already gone over, and is mostly cutscenes. The chapter ends the same way. While it's not entirely cutscenes, it is an hour and a half of absolutely linear, forced content. And I don't think there are going to be very many players that are in the mood to go through an hour and a half of that experience because it is completely unpolished. That's what we like about it when we're allowed to engage with it at our own rate, but that's not something that shines through when we're forced to engage with it on the game's schedule. The open world is also pretty bad. They let you loose into it pretty early to let you explore and do whatever you please, and they even have permanent HUD markers for every single point of interest on the entire map, so you won't miss any. But they don't exist. Every single point of interest is disabled until you've moved through the linear story far enough to unlock it. And this includes things that shouldn't be locked, like why can't I buy upgrades for my skateboard until the middle of Chapter 2? Would letting me buy upgrades for my skateboard interfere with the story in Chapter 1? No. This means that exploring the open world is actively obnoxious because you'll find those HUD markers, you'll chase them down, you'll find something that looks interesting, and the game will just say, "It's closed. You can't do anything here." Eventually, the open world becomes a little bit more interesting as you unlock additional activities such as hunting for hidden objects and stuff like that. But when the game first lets you loose into this open world and gives you a full day of enforced freedom, and you realize there is nothing in this town that you can interact with, that's not good pacing. It's enforced nothing. It's just as bad as enforced linear storyline. The combat doesn't help here. All of the combat is exactly the same regardless of who you're engaging or where. Even when you're being constantly swarmed between 12 and 6 a.m., there is nothing that ever varies. It doesn't matter where you are or how low on supplies you are or anything like that. You just always have the same fights at all times. That's a huge problem because that's the only thing in the open world for the first chapter. Fights. And they're garbage. And of course, those same garbage fights are part of the enforced linear experience at the end of the chapter. Serious pacing issues. When it comes to janky games, I think we can really improve playability not by actually improving the game, but by simply changing the pacing. This is an important consideration that doesn't get discussed very much, but in essence, you need to have bite-sized content. You need to have content that the player will feel like they've accomplished something when they go and do it, but content that doesn't stick around for so long that the player realizes how poor your presentation is. Obviously, this needs to be backed up by some kind of play where the player is allowed to go do other things for a while. This doesn't mean that it has to be an open world game, but it does mean that there do have to be mode switches available. The player has to be allowed to shake off the awkwardness of the last Jankfest you showed them and prepare for the next Jankfest. And that means they have to have some amount of something else to do. An open world is one particular example of that kind of scaffold, and it works pretty well, as long as there are things to do in your open world. This game doesn't really have anything to do in the open world until most of the way through the first chapter, and it doesn't really start to unlock things until the middle of chapter 2. That is way too slow. There are a ton of examples of how to set up this kind of experience. For example, card games, optional golf, optional fishing, optional battles in an optional battle arena, side quests. Anyway, it turns out this game has pretty bad pacing, and I think that was a major problem. I think that's why a lot of people don't like it. But that's another reason why it's so good to study. Let's learn from their mistakes.
Just give me a little more time.